I am a professor de classe préparatoire, which is not possible to translate in English. I'm sort of lecturer in Latin, Greek, and French in North France. I recently discussed my doctoral thesis on an onomastic history of the god Hades from pre-Homeric times to Plato. And I apologize in advance for my English, which is very poor indeed. And the severe cold I caught a few days ago isn't going to help, I guess. This shouldn't be a problem during the reading for the paper, but when it comes to be the question time, I will ask you to be indulgent. And in the worst case, I will answer maybe in French or in Italian. We will see. So, where do the names of the Greek gods come from for a partly new reading of Herodotus' answer? The explanation of onomata is one of the fields in which the polytropos intelligence of the Greeks was applied from the earliest period of Hellenic culture. While anthroponyms and common nouns were the first object of linguistic reflection by the Homeric Aoidoi, theonyms are only occasionally analyzed in Homer and Hesiod, despite famous exceptions, of course, such as the name of Aphrodite in the Theogony. This is no doubt due to the fact that the divine origin of the divine names themselves was beyond doubt for the archaic poets. Hence, etymological analysis, which aims to explain the human onomata by smaller but still equally human onomata, could seem of little relevance. On the other hand, etymological interpretations of divine names developed from Heraclitus onwards and continued among the tragic poets. Then they culminated in Plato's Cratylus, of course, in the 4th century, and excited the imagination of the Stoics from the 3rd century onward. Finally, they gave rise to a wealth of scholarly work among Alexandrian grammarians and late lexicographers. A veritable theology by name was developed, the history of which can be followed. The etymology of the theonym, clarified by phonic comparisons, etiological interpretations, or grammatical analysis, was each time the pretext for unfolding a discourse on divinity, which was certainly fragmentary, but interesting to study for us. Theonyms have come to attract the attention of ancient etymologists of all stripes for a linguistic reason that is both simple and highly problematic for us. Unlike most other Greek proper names, Greek divine names are opaque, I mean not transparent from a linguistic point of view. In the case of anthroponyms, the broadest and most widespread onomastic category of Greek names and of names in general, of course, the Greeks were used to being able to read and understand most names thanks to their transparency. Some examples: Philippos, he who loves horses; Alexandros, he who protects men; Timotheus, he who honors the gods, etc., and so on. All these names have a transparent meaning, both for Greek speakers, ancient Greek speakers, I mean, and for modern scholars. But what do names like Poseidon, Ares, Hera, and Apollon mean? The name of Zeus himself remained opaque to the ancients. Theonyms are essential for evoking divine power in a ritual and for grasping its identity. And yet they remained inexorably and completely opaque to ancient Greek speakers. Our situation is not very different. Only the name Zeus has been illuminated by modern linguistics and Indo-European comparison. The strangeness and foreignness of these names did not fail to challenge the ancient themselves, of course. Where do they come from? Why do they sound so un-Greek? When were they given to the gods? By whom and how? Today we are going to study Herodotus' answer to all these questions following the outline given below. Here, on the other hand, is a very selective bibliography. I try to make my PowerPoint. Okay, sorry, no. Okay. Sorry. Here, on the other hand, is a very selective bibliography of the main studies and commentaries that I have used to develop my own interpretation of the passages we're going to study. The bibliography on these matters is, of course, very huge, so this is very selective. So let's start with some general matters for the introduction. First, why Herodotus on God's name? Let's talk about his originality and singularity. Herodotus is something of an exception, indeed, to the Greek investigation of divine names in several aspects. Herodotus' interest in language lies at the crossroads between the Ionian ethnographic tradition and the Athenian sophistical innovations. However, the originality of Herodotus' view of language lies at the margins of this intellectual framework. Indeed, it is the historian of Halicarnassus who gives us the first and maybe the last explicit and developed reflection on the origin of Greek theonyms. This is not, of course, an etymological investigation. The linguistic comparison of the poets, pre-Socratic thinkers, and sophists, all of whom will have a place in Plato's Cratylus, are of no interest for Herodotus. There are very few exceptions. As an historian, Herodotus does not look into the etymons of each name, but into the historical and geographical origins of the names of the Greek gods in general, while going into more detail on a few specific issues. In so doing, Herodotus achieves two minor revolutions in relation to the thinking on divine names first done by the Ionian thinkers and then by the sophists. Firstly, the latter's thinking remained confined within the boundaries of the Greek language and its lexicon. This is not the case of Herodotus. This thing added to the exegetical tradition of the Homeric rhapsodes would later lead to the flourishing of Alexandrian techne grammaticae. This is the tradition of Ionians and Sophists. Herodotus' approach, on the other hand, marks the transition from a monolingual approach to a multilingual comparison. Secondly, the second minor revolution, as to say, is that Herodotus, who paid little heed to philosophical speculation on language, was the first to devote himself to what we might deliberately and anachronistically describe as the history of languages or linguistic ethnography. Herodotus' interest in the various Greek languages, and above all in foreign languages, is not simply a matter of curiosity, even if his knowledge in this area is exclusively second-hand, as Tom Harrison has shown. Herodotus does not seem capable of speaking or writing any foreign language. Moreover, his approach probably had predecessors who are little known to us, particularly in the Greek colonies of Asia Minor. However, this interest in foreign languages had almost no posterity. In our Greek sources, there is an abundance of reflection on the about the Greek language, but no source bears witness to any study carried out by the Greeks on known Greek languages before the late lexicon of Hesychius. This absence can no doubt be explained by what Arnaldo Momigliano and François Hartog have shown in two different ways about Greece in the classical and Hellenistic periods. I would like to paraphrase the words of Lorenzo Miletti, which seem to me to be very accurate. The error of the Greeks, as a famous work by Arnaldo Momigliano is entitled, would be to conceive the non-Hellenic cultures as a mere object of curiosity, whose cultural categories would be destined to remain obscure for a lack of a deep linguistic knowledge of the foreign language that expresses them. For a Greek, in fact, without a deep knowledge of the language, no deep understanding of a culture is possible. This applied not only to their own language and culture, but also to those of other peoples. From then on, these obscure foreign culture categories, by virtue of their analogical alterity, could at most serve as a game of mirrors and reversals, by which the Greeks intended above all to better represent their own culture through the paradoxical characteristics of that of the battle. As we shall see, the same applies to the names of the gods. The attention Herodotus pays to foreign theonyms actually serves to develop a discourse on Greek theonyms, on their strangeness and their illegibility through purely Hellenic linguistic material. I would like to start by giving you a quick overview of 6 linguistic notions specific to Herodotus' inquiry, which seem to me to be the most important in general and for my students in particular. Sorry. Feature number 1, phone and nomoi. Language, phone, most often in Herodotus, is an integral part of a people's nomoi and therefore of their identity. This applies to Greeks and non-Greeks alike. For the former, we recall the famous passage in Book 8, where Herodotus lists what defines Greek identity: same blood, same language, common sanctuaries, similar rituals. As for the latter, Herodotus systematically remarks on the linguistic situation of a people when he mentions it in his histories. This can happen even for remote peoples, and Herodotus' remarks, which are usually wrong from the point of view of modern linguistics, of course, can also be quite specific. Kinship, similarities and dissimilarities between neighboring languages, history of the evolution and mutual influences of languages, etc., etc. There are many examples of these in the 2 studies by Tom Harrison and Lorenzo Miletti. Feature number 2. Non-identity between people, ethnos, autochthony, and language. It is not enough for a people to be a native speaker of a language, to be part of the ethnic group that speaks it. Indeed, the same people in the course of its history can change language by learning another one. This is the case for Carians and Kaunoi, for example, in Book 1. Vice versa, one and the same ethnic group may have changed language or languages in the course of its history. The most famous example is obviously that of the Greeks themselves, and in particular the Attics formed from the ancient Pelasgians. We will see it. Similarly, the fact of being autochthonous is not enough to guarantee membership of a linguistic group. Feature number 3, notion of the caractère of a language. For Herodotus, the caractère is the set of features that make up the ethnic and linguistic unity of a people. There are languages with a particularly strong and stable caractère, such as Egyptian language, others with a weaker caractère and therefore more subject to the change process, métabolé, which we will discuss. Feature number 4, the inductive approach and archaeological reconstruction by conjecture, tekmerion. Herodotus repeatedly used the verb tekmairomai in passages concerning the history of languages, and in particular that of the language of the Pelasgians. From the observation of the contemporary state of a people and its language, a more recent synchrony, modern linguists would say, Herodotus reconstructs by conjecture according to a diachronic approach of linguistic archaeology, a more ancient state or synchrony, as we would say. This should in no way lead modern researchers to regard Herodotus' conjectures as mere unproven hypotheses of little value to Herodotus himself. On the contrary, Herodotus only insists on the method he used to obtain this knowledge. We will see it in act in studying the case of the Pelasgians. Feature number 5, the topic and diachronic approach and the metabolae of languages. What interests Herodotus, above all, is the origin and changes that characterize the history of languages of different peoples in different places and different times. For Herodotus, the history of a language is first and foremost a history of metaboli, of processes of changing from one language to another, for example. As Miletti writes, I quote him, the natural development, I quote and translate, of course, the natural development, so to speak, of the relationship between people and language seems to be the changing process, metabole. Otherwise, we see the creation of linguistic islands in which certain archaic languages survive as fossils. We will also see that this phenomenon of changing can also concern specific nouns and not just an entire language. It is then a question of translation, or better still, of identifying the two nouns that have one and the same referent, in two different languages. I mean by referent the technical object of the referred object. When Herodotus is able to indicate which of the two peoples took and modified the name used by the other people, he sometimes uses specific meta-language, notably the verb metonomazo, which insists on change with meta, or the verb analambano, which insists on the reprise. Feature number 6, the last one, referring, co-referring, and proper nouns. As Miletti shows, the main linguistic question of interest to Herodotus is dictated by the polyglot and multi-ethnic nature of the ecumene he describes. To which referent does this or that word correspond in this or that language? This mainly concerns what Herodotus calls the onomata, proper names, later called onomata curia from Denis the Thracian onwards. Within this framework, the linguistic problem that most catches Herodotus' attention is that of co-reference. How do you call a single referent in the language of such and such, of that or that people? Co-referencing in different languages becomes a problem when the referents in question are objects that are unique in space and or time, such as cities, regions, rivers, peoples, and of course, gods. In these cases, Herodotus most often, but not systematically, uses metalinguistic glosses, which have the following pattern: the referent er, for example, called Kalein or onomazesai X by people Y is called Z in Greek, kata Hellenon glossan. In these cases, there is no semantic equivalence, in other words, no literal translation, but only a referent correspondence. Two completely different signifiers for one and the same signified. An easy example is the Egyptian name for the region Oasis, translated into Greek as Makaron Nessos, the island of the blessed ones, in Book 3, Onomadze Taideo Horos Hutos Kata Hellenon Glossan Makaron Nessos. The word oasis is attested in Egyptian hieroglyphics. We do not know its etymological meaning, but we do know that it is taken up shortly after Herodotus by the Coptic Uahe, place of habitation, and then by the classical Arabic Waha, green place in the middle of the desert. In short, the meaning of Island of the Blessed Ones, Makaron Nessos, was undoubtedly absent from ancient Egyptian. The same apply, and so this is not a translation, but just a co-referring name, proper name. The very same applies to the names of the gods. The same divine power is called Zeus by the Greeks and Amun by the Egyptians, for example, in book number 2, or Artemis by the former, Bubastis by the later, always book 2, or Apollo and Horus, etc., etc. The principle underlying this approach is well known and is similar to what Pliny would later call interpretatio Graeca. The divine powers are the same or almost the same everywhere, but their proper names change according to place. It is not a question of translation at all, but of more or less identical reference having names whose signifiers are completely different. But we will see, that this is true at the age of Herodotus, so in the more recent synchrony, we could say in a linguistic way. But in the case of history of language, as Herodotus does it, it is quite different. While Herodotus makes numerous linguistic observations about much smaller peoples, he says nothing about the language of the Egyptians, to whom he devotes almost an entire book. This is quite strange. In short, their language, Egyptian, is self-evident to Herodotus and his readers, without any need to spell it out. For example, in Book 2, chapter 105, about the Kolkhoi, descendants of the Egyptians. And this is true even if Herodotus does not know Egyptians or is not capable to speak it. This means that there can be no doubt that Herodotus or any of his Greek readers may have thought that the names of the Greek gods, we will see that, or better still, the Greek names of the gods, were Egyptian names. The absolute alterity of the two languages was as tacit as it was obvious. On the other hand, Herodotus' treatment of the Egyptians mirrors his treatment of all particularly ancient peoples. When he talks about the history of customs, and in particular the cults of younger peoples, Herodotus attributes the origin of these customs to contact and exchanges with an older people. In this context, the Egyptians, by virtue of their antiquity and cultural prestige, are the pourvoyeurs of Mediterranean customs par excellence. An important fact should be noted. This is not the case of the Hellenists themselves, whose history, more complex and less uniform, calls for remarks on the birth of the Greek language, in which the Dorians, and in particular the Spartans, the Pelasgians, and the Ionians, in particular the Attic people, all play a part. The people, ethnos of the Greek, the Hellenist, is composed for Herodotus mainly of two Gene strains, I think in English. The Dorian Genos, Sparta, of course, and the Ionian Genos, Attica, Laconia and Attica. The former, Dorian, has always belonged to the Greek ethnos, but it had to migrate for a long time before finding its permanent home. The later, Ionian, on the other hand, is descended from the Pelasgic ethnos and has never abandoned Attica. We read it in Book 1, chapter 56, paragraphs 1 and 2. This makes the Greek language at least partially barbaric in origin. Yet we know how much importance the Greeks attached to their language, precisely in the cultural distinctions by which they set themselves against non-Greek peoples, the barbaroi, precisely, those who stammer, since they do not speak correctly Greek. But the most thorough and sophisticated investigation into the language of a people and on the relationship between languages and different peoples in Herodotus' respective investigation. Is Herodotus' respective investigation into the language of the Pelasgians in Book 1, chapter 57 and 58. Herodotus begins by saying that he does not possess exact knowledge of the language that the Pelasgians spoke before their Hellenization. Uk echo atrekeos eipein, he says. However, he claims to be able to reconstruct it by conjecture, tekmairomenon legin, as I told you before. He can conjecture it from the language spoken by the Pelasgians, who still existed in his time in the Italian peninsula. This is a great question which has been much studied and on which I shall not dwell. In fact, as Miletti says in his book, researchers have concentrated a great deal on the real or fictional existence of the Pelasgians and have neglected Herodotus' reflections on the language of the Pelasgians and its place in the history of the Greek language and in Herodotus' reflections on languages in general. And it is no coincidence that the Pelasgians appear several times in the histories, for example, in Book 2, chapter 171, or Book 4, chapter 145, etc., whereas they are the protagonists of the narrative only when it comes to their language. This is the case in Book 1, chapter 57 and 58, about the birth of the Attic people and the Hellenized Pelasgians, and in Book 2, of course, about the names of the gods, as we will see. We need only to retain the essential here. The Pelasgians originally spoke a barbarian language, idemest, not Greek. Hesan hoi pelasgoi barbaron glossan hientes, says Herodotus. And the Attics, who were formerly Pelasgians, learned Greek language when they accomplished their metabole, that is, their Hellenization. To Attikon ethnos eon pelasgikon, hama te metabole te Hellenas. Do you have a passage? Yes, sorry. To Attikon ethnos eon pelasgikon, hama te metabole te es Hellenas kaiten glossen metemate. Their learning of Greek is therefore indeed a change of language, metabole, as it is the transition from the language of the Pelasgians to the Greek language itself, kaiten glossen metemate, with metamantano, insisting on learning as changing. We can compare the verbs metalambano and metafero with the verb metamantano. Metalambano and metafero, which would become common in classical Greek later to designate the operation of translation itself. We can therefore imagine that, according to Herodotus, at this time, the Pelasgian or Attic people had to translate a whole host of words, particularly their own, which designated reference linked to the Pelasgian civilizations, and which had no equivalents in Greek. The process of transforming the Pelasgian language into Greek was, moreover, radical and complete. According to Herodotus, in fact, the Greek people have been using their language ever since they formed. He says, glosse aiei kote teute diachratai, Greek having completely supplanted Pelasgian language. This is an important fact because it means that the Greek of Herodotus' time, in his own opinion, of course, no longer had any identifiable Pelasgian features. Moreover, the Pelasgians, who formerly inhabited all the regions of Greece, were not only the ancestors of the Greeks of Attica, they were also the initiators of several religious practices throughout the Greek world. For example, in Book 2, chapter 51, we read about the Itiphaling Hermes in Attica and from there throughout Greece, as well as the Samothracian mysteries, as due to the Pelasgian peoples. This gave them particular prestige in religious matters and brought them closer to the Egyptians in Herodotus' own of history. The first explicit hypothesis on the origin of Greek theonyms that has come down to us is to be found in Book 2 of Herodotus' Histories, but it is broken down into 4 passages, which we shall examine in the order shown on the slide in here. If Herodotus' discourse on the origin of Greek theonyms may have seemed incoherent in places, this is because it's unfolded and in a fragmented and non-linear way, with back and forth prolapses, ellipses, and analepses, as it is usual with the Pater Historiae. Herodotus' argument must therefore be rerun in chronological order, taking particular care to read at the very end the first passage in which Greek theonyms are discussed. This is Book 2, 4:2, the last passage we will study. And we have to study it at the very end because of its elliptical prolapsis narrative form. Has, in my opinion, this is the problem that often missold commentators. The protagonists of this narrative are first and foremost barbaroi, as everyone knows, and only and only eventually the Greeks. Mainly, the Egyptians are the protagonists, whose cultural prestige and foreignness to Greek culture Herodotus celebrates at the same time, but also the Pelasgian people, and to a lesser extent the Libyans and the Phoenicians. Just as I am not going to dwell on the question of the meaning of barbaroi in Herodotus, so I am not going to summarize for you the many interpretations that have been put forward to explain the passages we are going to study, which have spilled rivers and rivers of ink. I will therefore limit myself, for lack of time, to presenting you with my own interpretations, which are, of course, indebted in several places to the secondary bibliography I have started. The debate begin with some general questions before reading the passages I have listed. And the most important is the meaning of onomata, which is a false debate in my very opinion. This is a false debate and as Miletti writes, and I may say something about Miletti's book, which is maybe less than others. Miletti concentrates himself on language and meta-language, so way of speaking about language in Herodotus, and his book is a very intelligent, nice one. I learned a lot of things reading him, and he shows that unoma in Herodotus means exclusively name, and more precisely, proper name. We should also stress, along with Miletti, that in the passages we are about to study, it is the names of the gods that occupy the place of subjects in sentences containing verbs of movement. This is indeed a linguistic transfer involving names and not the transfer of a cult or a process of naming. And the last general question is the distinction between divine power and its name. As for the divine powers themselves, and not their cults or their names in this case, we must not forget that for Herodotus, divine powers are almost the same everywhere, as I said. This means that these powers do not need to come to Greece as did Greek theonyms. They were already there. We just didn't know, Greek people just didn't know their names yet, as we shall see. Miletti is right to insist on one of the passages that opens almost programmatically the book 2 concerning the most religious of peoples, Egyptians, of course. I quote the translation. Now, a very word-to-word translation. Now, the things concerning the gods which I have heard, I do not intend to relate, with the only exception of the names of the gods, exo eta unomata auton munon. For I am persuaded that on these divine things, with the exception of the names, therefore, men all have the same knowledge. So, in Herodotus' view of things, the only things that he has to explain about gods in different countries are precisely the names. We can now get down to studying these two long passages by Herodotus. Let's ask first about the conclusion, which he announces at the outset and only then illustrated with examples. This is the way Herodotus constructs his reasoning, but not his account, which has two sources, the Egyptians and the Oracle of Dodona. So the starting sentence, Schedon de kai panton taunomata ton theon ex Aegyptu elelute esten Hellada. Almost all the names of the gods came to Greece from Egypt. This does not mean that the Greek theonyms known to Herodotus were Egyptians, of course. That would simply be absurd. But that the names of the gods of the Greeks had come to the territory of Greece, as then Hellada, says Herodotus, from Egypt, which is very different. Let us not forget that Greece, according to Herodotus, was formerly inhabited by a people, the Pelasgian, who did not speak Greek language. Let us now summarize in reverse order the additional information that Herodotus claims to have learned from his research. To begin with, we could try to summarize this complicated description in the following diagram. Which will evolve over the course of my presentation and in which I concentrate exclusively on the major theonyms. I will give you three remarks. First, the Greeks learned the names of all their gods from the Pelasgian, a people who originally knew no Greek, I remember you, with the unique exception of Poseidon, whom they learned from the Libyans. We will then see that the name of Aphrodite is also an exception, while that of the one of Dionysus deserves a few more moments later. The second thing is that the Pelasgians, who gave neither onomata nor eponymie to their gods, whom they simply called theoi, according to an etymology found in the Cratylus too, in turn learned most of these names from the Egyptians and adopted them after obtaining the agreement of the Oracle of Dodona, except that one of Dionysus, which was adopted by the Pelasgian much later, and which the Pelasgian learned from a different source, here unexplained. hoi pelasgoi Dionysu de hysteron pollo e putonto. This is the information we have in the passage of the book 2. Sorry. The third and last thing I would like to say on this diagram is that among the names of the gods that the Egyptians never knew, the Pelasgian learned that one of Poseidon from the Libyans, while those of Hera, Hestia, Themis, the Dioscur, Charites, Nereides, and later that of Dionysus were transmitted by them to the Greeks without it being known from which people the Pelasgian had themselves learned them, not forgetting that they did not themselves give name to their gods. And so sorry, I can't well I'm not able to pronounce it well Greek god's name in English, so I used to say it in ancient Greek. This is easier for me. Let's now turn to two particular and particularly difficult cases for which we have to look for information outside the two passages from Book 2 reproduced above. This is about Dionysus and Aphrodite. Let's start with Dionysus. According to Herodotus, this god is also of Egyptian origin, as shown by the existence of an equivalent god among a people much older than the Greeks. This is the first passage I quote in the slide. However, as we have seen, the name Dionysus arrived in Greece later, in a very archaic period. Herodotus even gives a relative chronological indication, speaking of 16 centuries before his time. This is the second passage I quote. Herodotus had already explained the complex history of the arrival of this name in Greece earlier, and this is the third passage in the slide. In addition to the Egyptians, this story involves the mythical figure of Melampus of Pylos and the Phoenicians. This is a very complicated history about whom I made some personal reflections. In the Odyssey, Melampus is a Greek soothsayer, a Greek prophet from Pylos. According to Hesiod, quoted by Pausanias, his father's name is Amutaun. Amutaun is a transparent name, precisely emphasizes language. Amutaun means ineffable or mute. Melampus, however, is also linked to Egypt. Indeed, his name, Melan plus pus podos, is also speaking and means black-footed, which is obviously linked to Egypt, in my opinion. Moreover, Herodotus says that he learned the art of divination from the Egyptians themselves. Finally, Melampus was in contact with the Phoenicians. Again, according to Herodotus, Melampus did not learn the name of Dionysus directly from the Egyptians themselves, but from Cadmus of Tyre. This complicated story can be summed up as in the following diagram. You will see it in here. So you have the Egyptian origin of Dionysus, and then the first passage, the Phoenicians with Cadmus of Tyre. The slide is in French, sorry. And finally, eventually, the the figure of Melampus of Pylos, which is connected both with Egypt through his names, Melampus, and his knowledge of divinity, and in contact with Phoenician, and eventually the name becomes Greek. Let's now turn, sorry. Why this complicated history for Dionysus? Herodotus needs a second intermediary after Egyptians, just as with other divine names, which coming from the Egyptians first pass through the language of the Pelasgians before reaching the Greeks, as we saw. Here, however, another intermediary was chosen, not the Pelasgians, but the Phoenicians, as in the case of Aphrodite, as we shall see. To sum up, the history of the name Dionysos in Greece begins in Egypt before the second millennium, passes through the Phoenicians and arrives in Greece thanks to Melampus, a Greek character linked to both the Egyptians and the Phoenicians. Let's finish with Aphrodite, whom Herodotus does not mention here because he has already spoken about her in Book 1. In Book 1, Herodotus spoke of the cult, or more precisely, the temple, of Aphrodite Urania in the Phoenician city of Ascalon in Syria. And this temple, he says, is the oldest known temple to the goddess, and the two most archaic Hellenic temples, the one in Cyprus and one in Kythera, both derive from this very first Phoenician temple according to their builders themselves. Does this mean that the name Aphrodite also comes from Phoenicia? This is highly probable in my opinion, but it must be deduced from the text because Herodotus does not make it explicit. Here then is a complete outline of the origins of Greek theonyms according to Herodotus, as reconstructed from the evidences cited, with all the pieces of this this crazy puzzle. One point is immediately obvious. For Herodotus, not only are known of the names of the Greek gods of Greek origin, but these names are of doubly barbarian origin, as Philippe Bourgeot has written, des noms doublement barbares. Despite their different original origins, mainly Egyptian, less often Phoenician, Libyan, or unknown, they are all of non-Greek origin, and above all, almost all passed into Greek via the Pelasgian people. In one case, via the Phoenicians, and in only two cases directly from Libyan or Phoenician into Greek. As far as the opacity of Greek theonyms is concerned, according to Herodotus, the incomprehensible character is due to the barbarity of the origin, as Monique Dixot has written. Of course, from an historical point of view, Herodotus' construction should not be given any credence, even if he claims to rely on direct testimony from the Egyptians and the oracle of Dodona. But these texts, which are unique for the history of Greek theology and the religion, can still be interpreted from the point of view of linguistic anthropology, for example. For Herodotus, almost all Greek theonyms imply 2 degrees of foreignness to the Greek language and culture. It is very interesting to know, for example, that just one theonym, Aphrodite, which is perhaps the Greek theonym that poses the most problems in terms of its origin, has only one degree of foreignness for Herodotus, and that the origin he attributed to it, Semitic or Oriental in general, is the same as that one attributed to it by many historians of religion and Greek language today. This is no doubt due to the famous etymology of Aphrodite's names in Hesiod's Theogony. The theonym is precisely attached to the name Aphros, which would explain why it sounds in a way more Greek than the other theonyms. Perhaps this invites us to look somewhat differently at the role the Pelasgian play in the whole history. While they undeniably symbolize the foreign and archaic character that the Greeks lent to the names of their gods, their role as intermediaries in all circumstances is also interesting. Herodotus must have perceived the Greek theonyms as foreign, of course, but not to the extent of attributing them directly to the Egyptians, Libyans, or Phoenicians, whose religious customs and language he knew were completely different from that of the Greeks. Not complete, but partly different from that of the Greeks. In other words, he must have felt that there was something Aegean, even vaguely Hellenic, in most of these names. Thus, the Pelasgian, who had settled in Attica much earlier than Homer and Hesiod, in Herodotus' opinion, of course, Homer and Hesiod, who had assimilated perfectly. Thus, the Pelasgian, who had settled in Attica much earlier than Homer and Hesiod, who had assimilated perfectly with the Greek over time to the point of adopting their language while forgetting their own language, became for Herodotus the perfect intermediaries to explain the origin of the Greek theonyms that arrived, it says, in Greece from Egypt. As for the Egyptians, the most scrupulously religious of all men, as he describes them in Book 2, Theosebes de Perissos eontes malis tapanto anthropon. They are undoubtedly their first and foremost to confer on these ancient and barbaric names the prestige of a religion and culture celebrated above all others in the Mediterranean, and this as early as Homeric times. Unable to derive Greek theonyms directly from those of the Egyptians, for obvious reasons of phonetical alterity, Herodotus defended the thesis that the pre-Greek intermediaries he needed, the Pelasgian people, prayed to anonymous gods who were only waiting to receive the sacred and prestigious names of the Egyptian gods. Finally, the Oracle of Dodona, with its pan-Hellenic authority, represents the theological and as well as cultural acceptance of the foreignness of these divine names, as well as their definitive acclimatization to the religious customs and sacred language of the Greeks, of which the oracle is the repository. As for the actual details of these linguistic transfers, which are unsurprisingly very vague in Herodotus, we will come back to them when we study the last passage I mentioned about the Critias of Plato. Now we need to take a quick look at another very famous passage, this time concerning the role played by Homer and Hesiod in the world's history of Greek theonyms. Sorry. As for the rest of this history, which is full of linguistic and cultural twists and turns, modern commentators on Herodotus have sometimes claimed that the historian contradicts himself in the immediate continuation of his account, where he gives a different version of the same facts. However, it seems to me that we need to return to this passage, which is also so often quoted, as I said, and reread it carefully in the light of those that precede. According to some, Herodotus gives a different origin for the names of the Greek gods in here. They go back to Homer and Hesiod, who gave them yesterday, so to speak. Greek theonyms would then be a recent creation, the creation of Hellenism itself, to quote Monique Dixot again. But this reading, which flies in the face of everything Herodotus passionately expanded earlier, is unlikely to be correct. It seems to me that it is based, among other things, on a fatal approximation. The erroneous identification of what is meant here by the noun eponymie with that was meant in the preceding passages by the noun unoma. Herodotus, in speaking of the Pelasgian and the gods they worshipped, seems to distinguish between these two notions, which he expresses by two different terms: the god's name unoma and his title or nickname. I don't know if this English term is correct. Eponymie, from epi and onoma. Idemest, probably what moderns call epithet. Now, Herodotus asserts that Homer and Hesiod were the first to give epithet, eponymia, to the gods. Kai toisi theoisi tas eponymias dontes. At no point in Herodotus' writing is there any mention of names in here, such as unomata, being imposed on the gods by Homer or Hesiod, or even of the Greeks discovering this name through the poems of Hesiod and Homer. The unoma is no longer in question here, since we are only talking about the eponymiae, idem the famous and numerous divine epithets in the archaic epic. There is therefore no contradiction in what Herodotus says on this subject. This is also consistent with the relative chronology that Herodotus gives for Homer and Hesiod, who are said to have lived around 400 years before him. In other words, by the time of the two poets, according to Herodotus himself, the names of the Greek gods had long been fixed. Only the epithets could still be invented by the two archaic poets, as could the mythical accounts of the birth of the gods, their timai, their technai, and their aideae. Nor should the end of the passage be interpreted as a kind of excusatio by the author for a contradiction for which he cannot be blamed. As to remote origin in time and space of the names of Greek gods, the information Herodotus gives his readers is that which he himself received from the priestess of Dodona and in which he unhesitatingly believes. So what, according to Herodotus, was the role of Homer and Hesiod, the nomastic history of the Greek gods? Nobody could understand the names of the gods. This is a fact. Hence, the need to make the divine personalities they referred to more legible, more readable, by explaining and elucidating them. In short, by making them transparent again. This is where the roles of Homer and Hesiod can be further specified. While we can certainly recognize the figure of the latter, when Herodotus speaks of theogony and the origin of the gods, we can think, on the other hand, that knowledge of some of the many divine epithets depended in particular, though not exclusively, on listening to and reading Homer. Homer would therefore have made a major contribution to, to naming these gods and to making these gods more Hellenic, more Greek, so to speak, with their doubly barbarian names, which the intermediation of the Pelasgian had only partly helped to bring closer to the Greek geographical and cultural space. This process of appropriation of Greek theonyms by the Greeks themselves, begun by Homer and Hesiod, was continued by later poets and scholars, such as Alexandrian grammarians, not only through the attribution of new epithets, but also and above all through etymology, which gave the divine names a Hellenic linguistic origin, a Greek linguistic origin. Eventually, it now remains for us to study the most problematic passage in this whole dossier, which is likely to illustrate the modality of the linguistic transfers we saw earlier, from Egyptian language to Greek language through Pelasgian language, in most cases. In an attempt to explain it, I will present a personal interpretation based on a little-known parallel between Herodotus' text and a pastiche of the same text by Plato. It is after having put this story in order that we can read, paying attention to the letter of the text, which is very, very elliptical, the prolapse of Book 2, Chapter 4, Paragraph 2. Here, Herodotus announces in advance what he will develop in paragraph 50 and 52 concerning the ultimate predominantly Egyptian origin of Greek theonyms. This passage poses several vocabulary problems, in particular that of the meaning of analabein, which we will have to elucidate. The expression eponymias parastheon analabein is indeed rare and problematic in Greek. The collocation analambano plus name unoma or custom nomos is absent in our Greek sources, with the one exception, the unique exception of the passage of Plato we will look at in a moment. And on the other hand, analambano plus the preposition para is absent in our classical Greek sources. How are we to understand the meaning of the aorist infinitive of alanambano here without prompting Herodotus to contradict himself by asserting that the Greeks took their theonyms directly from the Egyptians? This is very different. This is opposite to what he said. He will say in chapter 50 and 52, as we saw. Just think so of its meaning as a verb composed of ana, again, and lambano, to take. So take again, take up again, where ana insists that, on the fact that the Greeks were not the first people to take up the names of the Egyptians' gods. They had in fact been preceded by their ancestors, the Pelasgians, who in turn had passed on these names to them. Herodotus is making nothing more than a shortcut here, which is quite normal in a sentence that in 12 words should summarize what the historian will develop in several paragraphs later in Book 2. Instead of anticipating the whole chain and all the players, Herodotus is content limited. Herodotus limits himself to exploit the potential of Greek verbal composition to condense his point in here, as I illustrate it in this scheme at the end of the slide. This interpretation can be supported by an interesting parallel drawn from Plato, the only classical author in whom we read an expression analogous to Herodotus 1, involving both the verb analambano and the noun onoma. This is done, what is more, in a context surprisingly close to that of Herodotus. This is a rather farcical genealogical passage from the known part of the Critias, where Plato is moreover surely imitating, not without irony of course, older sources, including Herodotus himself, as several scholars have demonstrated, including a very rich study by Jean-François Pradot. Pradot even talks of a Platonic pastiche of Herodotus, studying his arguments in order to gain a better understanding of Plato's political philosophy. What interests me, however, is precisely what Plato tells us about his own reading and understanding of Herodotus' passage. Let us read this passage from the beginning of the account of Atlantis in the Critias. But let me please drink some water before. Before beginning my story, I must give you a brief warning, so that you will not be surprised to hear that barbarians often have Greek names. You will learn why. Solon, who was thinking of using the story of the first kings of Atlantis in his poems, having asked what the meaning of these names was, discovered that those who had firstly transposed them into their own language and written them down, autagraphamenus eisten auton phonen metenikotas, were the Egyptians, and himself in turn, rediscovering the original meaning of each of these names, wrote them down, adapting them to our language. Autos de aupalin hecas tutendianoian onomatos analambanon eisten hemeteran agon phonen apegrapheto. Here too, the verb analambano is employed in a situation of linguistic transfer in the onomastic domain, a transfer that can take place thanks to the intermediary of a third language. The barbarian names of ancient kings from Atlantis, where a barbarian language was spoken precisely, are first transposed into another barbarian language, this time Egyptian language, before Solon. On learning these names, I lost myself. Before Solon, learning these names, was the only one who could understand these names, which were incomprehensible as they stand and obviously foreign. And after that, Solon comes to understand their meaning thanks to his alleged knowledge of the intermediary language in the West Egyptian. The only real difference between Herodotus' passage and Plato's one is that in the former, it is a question of analambanein directly the names, whereas in Plato, it is a question of analambanein the meaning of names, hekastu tendianoian onomatos analambanon, which changes, of course, the meaning that should be attributed to the base lambanin in English, or in, take up again the names, or take up again the meaning of the names. But the nuance introduced by Anna is the same. Solon was unable to understand and to transcribe into Greek these names directly from the barbarian language from which they derived their origin, but had to go first through Egyptian, which plays here for these anthroponyms the very same role of linguistic and cultural intermediary that the language of the Pelasgian people plays for Greek theonyms in Herodotus. We can therefore imagine, following Plato's pastiche and his comprehension of Herodotus' text, that the transfer by which Greek theonyms originating in Egypt pass through the Pelasg definition, etc., until they arrive in Greek, takes place on the basis of the Egyptian language, in the mode of translation. Plato says effectively, tendianoian onomatos analambanon eisten hemetiran agon phonen. This last part of his sentence, eis ten hemetiran agon phonen, adds the operation of translation to the meaning of analambano. These successive translations, separated in time into different languages, would then be the metabolai, capable of explaining the origin of the Greek theonyms, as well as their very different present linguistic state. Herodotus makes none of this explicit, of course. This is just my idea, my hypothesis. However, an example from Herodotus that I found thanks to Miletti's book might support my hypothesis. When Herodotus wants to demonstrate that the Aigis figured on statues of Athena and other Greek religious customs originated in Libya, he explains this phenomenon with the help of a linguistic metabole, which is both a translation and a phonetic distortion. The name Aigides itself would have come from the Libyan women's custom of dressing in goat skin, Aigei. The Greeks would then have translated and transformed metonomasan, he says, Aigei, into Aigides. Aigides. Something similar could have been the case of Greek theonyms. However, there are still two problems with this interpretation of Herodotus' passage that I find difficult to resolve. Firstly, why does Herodotus speak here of 12 gods and not about almost the gods, skedon panton tonteon unomata, as he said, as he will say later in the book too? This is my first problem. And again, why does he speak here of eponymiae and not of unomata? It cannot be ruled out that these are the epithets and not the nouns themselves, as we saw before. Lorenzo Miletti, who is the only one who studied in deep detail the meta-language of Herodotus, argues that this is not a problem, since the term eponymia in Herodotus can also refer to any kind of noun, but the question remains open, however, and is problematic. So let's come to an end And to give some outlines. In the final analysis, it follows that the names of the Greek gods for Herodotus are not Egyptian at all, but are translations, as so to speak, of Pelasgian or Phoenicians. That is to say, autochthonous but pre-Greek, for Pelasgian, of course, but pre-Greek people. In other words, these names are very ancient and foreign at the same time. The implication is that when the Pelasgians assimilated with the Greeks and adopted their language by abandoning their own, these divine names had, of course, already been in use for some time, as confirmed by the fact that Herodotus considered the Egyptians and the Pelasgians to be older than the Greeks, and were therefore not translated again into Greek. This explains the opacity and the difficulty to understand, to give a meaning to those theonyms. In fact, Herodotus knew the names of the Egyptian gods whose complete phonetic alterity he could not fail to grasp. On the other hand, he could not have known the names of the Pelasgian gods, since they and their language had been completely assimilated into the new inhabitants of Attica for several centuries, as he says himself. For Herodotus, the cultural and linguistic intermediary offered by the Pelasgians was the perfect one, even speculative, linked to unwind a derivational chain capable of explaining the origin of these theonyms, bear literal resemblance to Greek names, and which Herodotus wanted to trace back to a religious tradition as prestigious as the Egyptian tradition, while at the same time giving them a kind of Aegean appearance. Most scholars, notably Tom Harrison and Lorenzo Miletti, have emphasized the importance of change in the history of languages, Greek and foreign, as conceived by Herodotus. Lorenzo Miletti believes that the question of change plays a very important role in the problem of divine names from Egypt. As for me, I think it is the fundamental key to reading these passages. It is the different metaboli that Greek theonyms have experienced that explain their alterity and opacity. Born in Egypt for most of them, or in Phoenicia or Libya, most of these names underwent a first linguistic metabole when they were adopted by the Pelasgian, and finally a second metabole when the Pelasgian language died with their complete Hellenization. What remained then were these extremely archaic and doubly barbarian divine names, which Homer and Hesiod contributed in their own way to make more Greek through the practice of poetic epic. Thank you for your question and for your questions, and I'm now, I hope, ready to answer your question. Thank you very much.